ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how. Hey there, and welcome back to yet another FileMaker tutorial video where we are going to learn more about FileMaker Pro. In this video tutorial, we're taking a look at mastering script triggers, understanding how you can use them effectively, because if you don't, it can get in your way and cause a lot of problems. Let's head over to my desktop and take a look at the file. Alrighty, thanks for joining me here on my desktop. You can see that we've got the file here, and you're going to be able to get this over at FileMakerMagazine.com if you're finding this on YouTube. Also, if you're interested, I have tons of other content for really learning and mastering FileMaker Pro in order to literally make your own software. FileMaker Pro is extremely powerful, so take a look over at FileMakerMagazine.com. All right, in this video, we are taking a look at script triggers. Now, script triggers, if you're not familiar, when we go into layout mode, many different things in FileMaker can take and use a script trigger. There's two primary places. First, there is the layout where we have triggers, and then any other object that's on the screen. So for example, this button right here. Yes, it can have script triggers. In fact, if we take a look, when I zoom in right here, there is that option right there, Set Script Triggers. You can either right-click on an object, or if you're on the Macintosh, you can hold down the Command key. If you're on Windows, I believe it's probably the Control key. I'm holding down the Command key right now, and when I double-click, up will come the Triggers window. Now, the easiest thing to understand about triggers, and something that I think triggers were around probably for a couple of years before I knew this, it is this. These triggers fire in the order in which you see them. So on-object enter is going to be first, before on-object keystroke, on-object modify, etc., etc. Now, as I stated, there are two places where you find triggers in FileMaker Pro. The second place is in the layout setup. So if we go up to the layouts menu up here up at the top, and we go to the layout setup option, the dialog is going to come up on screen, and this area right here we can see is script triggers. Now, script triggers is simply just a way for you to trigger a script to run at any given time. And again, these fire in the order in which we can see them on screen. So as I'm scrolling here, each of these on layout keystroke is going to fire before the on layout enter. Now, in this file that you're able to download from FileMaker Magazine, there is a really helpful setup in this file. In fact, I wish I could give credit where I first saw this, but when I was starting to learn triggers, there was a file that was provided by someone, I forget who it was, but it was absolutely invaluable for me to understand what was going on when I was setting up these script triggers. And I'm going to walk you through how you can use this file in order to do that for yourself. But before we do that, let's talk about the nature of script triggers that maybe you're aware of or maybe you're not. It is called pre and post, or those are the words that FileMaker used to use early on when they released script triggers, but now they're using before and after sometimes, at least when you look within the documentation. So let's talk about that. Hey there, this is Matt. Thanks for taking the time to watch my free videos on YouTube. This video has been sponsored by what we see on screen right here. Now, if you are looking for hosting, there's a ton of places that you can choose from, but I choose to go with fmcloud.fm, and I'll tell you why. They use the latest technology. Now, I haven't worked with other providers. They may be using the same technology, but I know the owner of fmcloud.fm, Fabrice Nordman. I trust him. I know he knows what he's talking about because his understanding of technology is absolutely solid. Now, these guys are using container-based technology. So every instance of your FileMaker server is completely isolated from another server. How does this benefit you? Well, because of that situation, they're able to provide all of the features, the full features of your FileMaker server. Now, if you go with some of the other providers, you may not have features that you would like to have, such as the ability to run your own plugins. And because each of these containers are isolated from each other, you really have a robust security setup. Now, if we take a look right here, just like any other provider, you can choose from all kinds of different places, anywhere across the globe that you might want to host. your FileMaker database system so that your latency is low and all of your clients are connecting really close to your FileMaker server. So if you're looking to set up your own FileMaker server or maybe migrate from another provider, then take a look at the link that I have in the description or on the video or on screen right now at filemakermagazine.com/hosting, and we'll redirect you to fmcloud.fm, where you'll be able to take advantage of their great offers. All right, pre versus post, and how can this get you in trouble? Well, how can script triggers in general get you in trouble? If you don't understand fully the pre versus post nature and events themselves, then you can get in a lot of trouble because these triggers will fire regardless, every time, all the time, and can really mess up with the flow of your scripts. Your scripts, one script may be calling another script, which may be calling another script, and you've got this really extensive flow. But if you're hopping from one place to another place and those script triggers are firing, they will interrupt that flow of A calls B calls C, because somewhere along that path, maybe you're jumping to a layout that has a script trigger. Speaking of script triggers, how can you see when a layout has a script trigger? Well, you can always see that by looking at the bottom corner of the layout. This particular layout does not have any script triggers. We'll switch to the layout that does have script triggers in this file, and there it is right there down at the very bottom. Now, if you do not have this icon and you need to know how to turn it on, we're going to take a quick trip to the View menu and the ever valuable Show menu. And here's where we're going to be able to show our script triggers. Right there, you can see that it's checked on. It is absolutely invaluable if you're using script triggers, which very useful they are, that you are able to see that little icon either on the layout or on the object. Also, within the Manage Layouts, which you're going to find under the File menu, when you go to File, Manage, and go to Layouts, when that comes up, which mine unfortunately is off screen, but let me bring it on screen, you can always see that a layout has a script trigger by the differentiation between this icon right there and the one that has the little star on it, meaning it's got triggers. It's also really good to know that you can access the script triggers from this Manage Layout screen by simply double-clicking. When you double-click, the same layout setup will come up, and you'll be able to access your script triggers like we did right there. So there's many ways in order to get access to this, but we really need to understand that pre versus post. So I'm going to go back to that layout, because if I go into this layout, as you will see, it will trigger all script triggers. I'm going to explain this file. One of the easiest ways to understand pre versus post is with a panel. So as I select right here, I can click and hold, and I can either get a slide or a tab control. Both of these are roughly the same thing. It's just that tabs are going to show tabs, whereas sliders are going to have the dots underneath. But functionally, they work exactly the same. Now, when I drag out a new panel or new tab control, and I put in just the value of 1 and then the value of 2, so I've got a 2-panel tab control here. I'm going to hold down the Command key, or as I stated, Control key on Windows, or actually I'll just right-click, and I will choose my script triggers and bring those up. I am going to set the on-panel switch trigger, so we can take a look at that. As it allows me to specify this, you're going to see in this particular file that I have all triggers accounted for. So this file becomes really helpful in understanding it on the dedicated layout that we're going to be taking a look at, because all triggers have been wired up. And this allows you to see the order and also some clues about some triggers that may fire that maybe you didn't think about that you could take advantage of. So when we look at the object triggers that I have right here, here is one of them, the on-panel switch. Now, I'm only going to go through this with this one particular object in order to explain pre versus post, but it should make sense that when the trigger fires, relative to the action or the event that was taken is what's important to understand. So we'll go into browse mode, and this panel now has a trigger on it. So this is going to be, I believe this is a pre-trigger is what's going to happen. In other words, the script is going to happen prior to the event. In this case, what is the event? The event is me clicking on this pane. I click. Now we can see that this dialog that has come up is telling me that the trigger that was fired was the on panel switch, and the button I've opted to name relative to what that particular trigger is. In this case, it is a pre-event. The event is clicking on the tab. The trigger is the on panel switch. It runs the script, and now I have the opportunity as the developer to either follow through with the event or not follow through with the event. So the script is going to run pre or prior to actually heading to the panel. Now, in some cases, this is good, and in some cases, this is bad, because sometimes you want to have something happen after you've gotten there, but FileMaker doesn't offer both flavors. It doesn't offer a pre and a post trigger for an on-panel switch. It only offers the pre. But here's what's really great to know. Like most things in FileMaker, you're able to solve the problem. For any script trigger that is a pre-event, you are able to create a companion or a post-firing of that pre-event. Now, for any script trigger that is a post-event, meaning it happens after the event has occurred, you can't go backwards. We can't go back in time. So with any post script trigger, you're just stuck with what that is. So let's take a look really quickly before of how we can stop the event. Because at this stage, the script has already run, but we can see that the panel actually switched. Now I've got a new dialog coming up here. This is not a native trigger in FileMaker. This on panel switch post event, this doesn't exist. You have to know that you can set this up in your script, and that's exactly what I've done. So we're going to take a look at how we can stop the event and also how we can set up post events and how we can take advantage of this file in order to learn more about how we can use script triggers in our own FileMaker solutions. All right, so moving on. Just before we're going to go take a look at our powerful magic layout that shows us all of the triggers, and I explain the ability to add a post event to pre-triggers and the ability to temporarily suspend the execution of script triggers, let's walk through how I personally implement script triggers and why I do it the way that I do it. I'm going to switch over in the inspector here, and I've added a field to this database. We're just going to drag this field out onto the layout, and I'm going to add a trigger to this. In fact, I already have, and I'm doing this so that I can explain what happens with regards to the follow-through of the event. Now, like I stated, the easiest one to see is with the panel switch. You can see that the script trigger ran before we got into the panel. Well, I could have set it such that we didn't end up in the panel unless certain criteria had been satisfied. We can do the same thing with, say, for example, a script trigger. So I'm using this as an alternative example. First off, what I'm going to do is hold down the command key, bring up my script triggers. We are going to be using an on-object keystroke for this particular trigger. Now, the way that I choose to personally name my scripts is to name them exactly correspondingly to how they are used. So right here, you can see that I have an on-object keystroke, and I don't know where I picked this up from, but I just really like it because it's very hard to confuse yourself. In other words, if I have an on-object keystroke, I select an on-object keystroke, and then I give it this name of whatever it applies to. Maybe I'll have an on-object keystroke player field, on-object or on-layout keystroke customers. Whatever the area is that you're working in within FileMaker, I just enhance the modification that I've named this. If you use just generally named scripts, it becomes very easy to confuse them because all of the rest of your scripts typically deal with your solution. I also tend to do this. In my scripting organization, most layouts get their own dedicated folder. So in this case, let's say, for example, this layout was a customer's layout. I would have a folder called Customers Layout, a one-to-one corresponding situation. One of the first subfolders that I will tend to have in that is a folder simply called Triggers. And I like to just group all of my triggers into a dedicated folder because it makes it much easier to mentally separate the rest of my scripts used for my UI and for my solution with the triggers, because managing your triggers gets a little bit more complex, especially as you add more and more. So when we select the On Object field, and we click and look OK, or click OK on this, and I go into this, we've got the trigger, we can see it right there, and we go into browse mode. Now, this field is receiving a trigger. Now, I'm going to bring up the debugger. Let's make sure that that comes up on screen. I've got it off screen here. Need to bring that on screen. Now, this script, as you're going to see, only has one single step. It is the exit script step, because this is really the only step you need to know if you're going to use script triggers. Now, this is going to be a, I don't know if it's a pre or a post. We'll just hit the number 5 right here. We have to select into the field. When the debugger was active, that's what had my focus. So that's why, I don't know if you heard it, but I had a little beep there. I hit the 5. So the trigger in this case is a post event, or no, it's a pre-event. So the script is going to run prior to the sending of the actual keystroke. Now, in this case, I hit the number 5. So I'm expecting the number 5 to show up in this field because I hit it on the keyboard, but it never will. And here's why. Because I am exiting with a false condition using an exit script step, the event in this case, which is the event of hitting the number 5 on the keyboard, will never happen. If I advance the debugger right now, we will see that nothing will end up getting in that field, and we can see right there the command operation canceled by a trigger script. So because I have a false on the exit of that particular trigger, the event itself never passes through. The important thing to take away here is that this is most impactful a lot of the times when you're using fields for, say, for example, search or filtering, and you want the user to perform multiple iterations of that filter or that search before they actually leave. One of the tricks in that is using the onObject save within a global field, and you simply do not exit the field because typically the key that the user hits is either the tab key or the return key. And if you don't pass those through, we never leave the field and the user's able to stay within this. But because it's only happening on the save, the user would have to change their filter criteria. A little bit of thinking that goes into that, but very, very useful. So if we take the opportunity to, let's say, I'm going to hit this again, and I'm going to do the little trick with the debugger here where you double click and it will bring up the script for you so that we can edit this. I'm going to edit this from a false to a true so that we can see this. I'm saving the script. It says, do you want to cancel or do you want to stop the execution of it? Yes, I do. And so now I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to hit the number 5, which I'm selected in the field. I hit the number 5. In this case, because we are exiting with a true, the event is passing on. So we advance the debugger. There's my 5, and that's the distinction. You either exit the script that is the trigger with a true, yes, I want to pass the event through, or a false, no, I don't. And sometimes you just have to figure out what the event is if it doesn't make sense to you. So having shown you all of the fundamentals, we can now take a walk through our magic layout, which as I click and bring this up, this is where you will get inundated with all of the different possibilities that happen, but allows you to understand what's going on with the triggers themselves. And then finally, we're going to break down how you can create a post event, and then also how you can suppress your triggers as part of your scripting workflow. All right, so here is the magic layout. If we click this button as it comes up, what we're going to see is in the scripting workspace, as I've already mentioned right here, I have a a dedicated script for all of the possible script triggers. Now, if these numbers are not on your copy of FileMaker, it is because I am using the MBS plugin, which gives me the canonical internal ID. Don't worry about it. You can just ignore these numbers unless you want to take a look at some of the MBS videos that I have here on YouTube. So as you can see, we have all of the possible script triggers here on screen, and then here are all of the object script triggers right here. Now, of course, not all script triggers are available to us. The on gesture tap only applies to mobile. And the on a object AV player change will really only apply to a container. The on panel switch will only apply to a panel, either a slider or tabs. But there are some triggers in here that sometimes you don't actually think about their available utility. And I'll show you one of them when we look at this layout. So when we bring this layout up, what's going to happen is every trigger possible in FileMaker is wired up. So we can see what happens is as a new layout has come up, the first thing we hit is an on layout enter. We can see it's a post event because there's the button. We also get an on mode enter, also a post event, given the button. We also have an on record load. Now, on record load is a very interesting one because there's sometimes that it's going to fire that you don't even think that it should because you're thinking as a developer, I'm loading a record, I'm loading data. Not necessarily the case. We'll take a look at that here coming up really quickly. An on layout size change. Now, why did this even happen? I didn't resize the layout. The only thing that happened was a brand new window came up. But because that layout is new to FileMaker, you do have access to the on layout size change. Now, that's one of those situations where you may have not thought, oh, I could use the on layout size change when a new window comes up. Yes, you can. You could use both the on, you could use the on mode change, you can use the on layout enter, or you could use the on layout size change. All of them happen when a new window comes up. So if I resize this, I'm only going to get the one trigger of the on layout size change, and it happens to be a post event. So we'll size that again. One of the things that I just alluded to was some of the script triggers that maybe you haven't even thought of using. Now, a really common thing to do with a portal is to have a button within that portal, and you click on the button and the button fires its trigger. But what if you only ever had data within a portal, but you still want a trigger to happen when the user selects into the portal? Well, it turns out that an on object enter within a portal will actually trigger a script. In other words, you can have buttons for free on a portal without ever putting a button in the portal, and you have established context. That is because we are selected in this portal row. Context has shifted from the main layout that we're on to the related record being shown in the portal, something that some newer FileMaker developers don't actually understand, but you have access to the path or the relationships on the graph that are taken because of this selection. And we can see that if I switch to another one here, what we're going to get is we have to exit this object, which will trigger, then we get the on enter for this. So we just exited the row that was selected, which in this case, because this is a pre-event, you have to think about some of these things. You have access to functions like get current active, I think it's called current. If it's not current, it's get active portal row number. So right now I'm on portal row number 1. I could still have access to that, and I would be able to know that the user jumped from row 1 to whatever row they end up being as the target. So you can do things with this knowledge that you have about these triggers. So there's the on object exit. Now we get the on object enter. So in that particular situation, we would be able to combine, you could always use global variables, but we would be able to combine our knowledge of the on object enter, exit, and the enter, and be able to do something to know what the starting row was and the ending row was for a user selection, something that can be useful in your UI. And we've got an on object exit post. Now, why did those fire? Why were there 3 events. I don't know if you saw that or you paid attention to that, but there were 3 instead of just 2. I didn't just exit and enter. There was an event that happened that FileMaker does not provide us with natively, and that's what we're going to take a look at right now. All right, and as we get close to our wrap up, here is what we are interested in as advanced FileMaker developers. As I try to zoom and get this on screen, there we go. In these scripts, in each of the scripts that are a pre-event, and the way that you can understand these scripts as I select this one and we just cycle through them, is we are looking at this right here. I have simply taken the opportunity of, rather than having the pre versus post nature of the script being obscured as the button within the show dialog that's showing us when the event actually happens, you can see that I've taken the opportunity to name the button a variable, and that variable is simply identifying whether this is a pre or a post event in terms of the script. Now, the on-record load, you can see right here what we're going to have. Let me switch back to the on-panel switch because that is a pre-event, which is what we're interested in learning about. So everything right here is just the event. I am telling you in the script step of the set variable, is this a pre-event or a post-event trigger? In this case, it's a pre, so the on-panel switch is going to run the script prior to actually switching the panel. So if, right here, again, we had an exit script, if we were to exit with the result of false, that means that the switch to the panel would never happen. Now, I've used this creatively. In fact, I have an application on the App Store that it starts on the first panel, and there's only a certain condition where I want to allow users to actually swipe to any panel beyond the first one, to the second, third, fourth, or what have you. So within the context of my script, I say something to the effect of, I have an if condition, and it says if you're going to be using a function called getLayoutObjectAttribute, and you would have the panel name, whatever it is, that's just how I name mine. And then you're going to have a condition that's going to be is front panel, something to that effect. And I can reverse this logic by saying if not. Then I can say right there, so in essence, I can say there's also values that you get from a panel switch. If target panel switch, and if you get the number of the panel, or you can get the name of the panel. In my case, I work with the name. If the name it matches anything other than the first panel and these other conditions aren't met, then I exit with a false, meaning no, you can't go to any other panel. So that's a really creative way that you can use script triggers. But given that everything in here is the trigger itself, whether it's a pre or a post, this is how you handle setting up any pre-trigger to also support a post trigger. Now, word of warning. You have to be extremely cautious with what we have right here and the order in which it happens, meaning the order in which these two steps, as I switch them right here, makes a huge difference and is impacted based on the value that you have right here. In other words, I can have this where I'm positively looking for an inbound parameter, which applies to a script trigger that does not normally take an inbound parameter. Otherwise, I'm going to do the inverse. The inverse would be something to this effect. If is empty, FMGSP right there, I have a shortcut for it. So if the script parameter is empty, then I could switch the logic of what I have here on screen. Absolutely. You always want to have the debugger up and active when you are testing any type of invocation where you are calling a script to be run over and over and over again very, very quickly. And that is exactly what is happening right here. What we are doing, in essence, and I'm actually just going to close this out and not save the script and go back to it because I can't remember what I was doing in the context of the dragging around there. But in this regard, what we're doing is we're saying When the on-panel switch runs, what happens is we are going to normally do our normal execution right here where we would say, hey, get a script name. You can see right here that isEmpty get script parameter is the opposite of having a parameter. So this is the inverse of this right here. In this case, I'm looking for a specific value, which is being passed in via an install on timer. But we're saying this script is going to run within 1/1000th or a millisecond. Yeah, a millisecond of time from when the pre actually triggered. So the way that this happens is really cool. On a panel switch, you click on the panel runs its pre-script and then switches to the script, but right as soon as it does, within a millisecond, it's already running another script, whichever script we had told it to run, which in this case is itself. So we're saying you are going to, because you are a trigger and you are a pre-trigger, we have told you that we want you to run again after the event has happened. So after we've switched, and everything within this area is going to execute. And again, this is a wonderful advantage because for any pre-event, you can also do a post-event. So in the whole of this file, which you're able to access on FileMakerMagazine.com, any of these scripts that we see that is a pre-event, which we can see right there when we read it, you're going to see that I have the additional logic right here that allows you to make that to also have a post event for that particular script. And again, my word of warning, I'll close the on record and not save that. My word of warning to you is always, always, always have the debugger running and test your post-based pre-triggered events with FileMaker. Otherwise, you will end up into this constant dialogue or constant running of the script. And really, the only way that you can get into it back into solving the problem is if you can invoke the debugger. And hopefully you have a key set to that. So that is how this works. So remember, for any pre-event, you get the ability to tack on the post-event, just have that trigger call itself and do whatever you want within the condition that is met. Now, we need to talk about what happens in your UI when you start to add a lot of triggers. As you will see, a lot of things will go on. I can switch this panel. I get the on exit. I get my on panel pre post. I get an object modify, which happened from my field. I've got an on panel switch, which I'm doing. Multiple triggers will be happening and they will interrupt your flow. If I have a button that's going to call a script, which will then call a script, which will then call a script, and I do anything else with any interaction on a layout where I'm using any script triggers on the objects or on the layout themselves, those triggers will fire, and we absolutely need a way to suppress them. So that's the final closing part of this video that we're going to be taking a look at, and we'll talk about the most simple way to put that in is right here, and we're going to address that right now. Okay, let's talk about it. Trigger suppression. There's really only two ways that you can deal with this. For the most part, in your UI, that's where you're going to be using triggers. You may have a trigger on a field or on a panel. And most of the time, your scripts are interacting with the same layout that is your UI. How do you avoid the triggers from the script triggers from being fired? Well, there's only two ways that you can really address this. You either go outside of your UI layout and you create a dedicated utility layout, which can be, in many cases, a blank layout. And fortunately, with FileMaker, you can do that by bringing up a card window anywhere in the layout. So anywhere on the whole of the layout or off screen. If you're using FileMaker Client, if you're using FileMaker Mobile, it can come up as a separate window. Whatever happens in the Manage Layouts, which I'll bring on screen right here, if there is this little indication, you have to know that things are going to be going on. So many times a FileMaker developer will create a dedicated layout, which in my case, a lot of times I will just create a layout called blank, and it will have the same context as my UI, but I know that for safety purposes, there are no triggers. There's no triggers on the layout, and there's no triggers on any of the objects on the layout. In fact, there's no objects on the layout unless required using some of the insert steps in FileMaker's legacy of the insert steps. And that's how you can pretty much be assured that nothing's going to happen. But there are those cases where you just have to work with your UI. Your UI is wired up to all of the different table occurrences that provides the structure that you need. So you have to have a way to suppress triggers. Now, as I bring up the debugger, when we are debugging, FileMaker curiously adds this opportunity for us to actually disable script triggers. Look at this right here that we have in the debugger. But here's the bizarre thing. Claris, which was formerly FileMaker at the time, decided not to give us a script step to forcibly disable triggers, but yet we can only do it with debugging. Very, very curious to myself and a lot of other longtime FileMaker developers that we do not, and we still do not, have a step that allows us to temporarily disable triggers, because it is absolutely something that you have to have if you're going to be using triggers in your UI and also need to script a workflow to your UI. So this is what I would consider to be the easiest way to manage that. We'll take a look at our on-panel switch. At the very beginning of every script trigger that you are going to use, no matter what it is, on-object enter, on-object keystroke, on-object modify, on-object validate, you can see these 3 steps right here. Now, triggers off is a custom function that I have created. The key here is use a custom function, and here is why. That custom function can contain any logic that determines whether or not triggers should run. Because what happens is when we get into this, the triggers will be bypassed by virtue of this step right here. We're going to exit. Now, whether you exit with false or true in regards to the events, that's something that you're going to have to manage specific to your solution. But let's take a look at triggers off, the custom function. We go over to manage. We go to our custom functions right there, and we bring up the custom functions and go to triggers off. Now, this is just a simple wrapper. That's all it is. Because what I have in my triggers off custom function is simply a reference to a global variable. This is probably one of the easiest ways to manage triggers is using a global variable. Well, some developers don't like using global variables. They want other conditions. Well, you can put whatever condition you want right here. If, for example, I was debugging this in the whole of my solution, if I just came in and did true right there, no triggers will fire ever, provided I have those first 3 steps at the beginning of any of my trigger scripts, because I'm telling it absolutely triggers are always off. But in this case, if I reference the global variable, then that means I'm able to temporarily suspend them. So let's take a look at how this works. I have a script right here called a button no triggers. It is within my trigger heavy layout that I have right here. Using the debugger, which I'll bring up right now, we can walk through this and see what happens. I'm going to click on this. So in this scenario, I've got my UI layout, and I know that there are triggers plastered all over the layout, but I need this script to run and not be affected by any script triggers. When I click the button of no triggers, what we're going to do is we're going to step through the script and see how easy it is to disable them. First off, I'm setting my variable. Now, we know that all other scripts are referencing the custom function that is wrapped around this global variable. So we're going to show our dialog, no triggers right here. You will not see any triggers, despite all of them being wired into this layout. We say, cool. We know that scripting also is impacted by triggers. It's not just a UI interaction. So in other words, just because the user clicks on one of these panels doesn't mean that the triggers won't fire when we use a script step. Scripts also behave and abide by script triggers, which is actually a good thing. But we can see we're going to go to this object. As soon as we do, then it's going to queue up a trigger. And we can see right here, we got an on object trigger. Actually, panel 2 was already switched. I should have been on panel 1. So that's why the panel didn't trigger. But because we went into the field, that has an on object enter. Well, because triggers off was set, the global variable, to true, it just immediately bails out. Now, this is a great thing because FileMaker scripts run so blazingly fast that going into the script triggers and then coming out of them within 2 steps is just super, super fast. And we can see right here, at the end of my script, I'm making sure to clear that script triggers because I want to reset my layout, or I want to reset this global variable to know that my triggers in my layout are going to behave as expected. And that's really all we have to have is this step, and those two sandwiched around whatever it is that I'm wanting to run without the script triggers actually firing off is going to actually happen. And that's how we deal with the triggers. And again, you can use whatever logic you want within that custom function. So the wrap up and the takeaway for script triggers is going to be this. Know that you've got pre versus post triggers. Also know that you can add any post trigger to a pre-trigger using an install on timer, and you just need to get it correct. Also, the fact that you need to avoid script triggers from triggering in your UI, there's a few ways you can solve that. The first one is to use dedicated blank layouts based on the same table occurrence where triggers are not installed and used, or you can forcibly suppress them unless and until Claris actually gives us a script step to disable those triggers within our scripts. But you can take control by using a wrapper custom function such as triggers off. So that's what we have for script triggers. I hope that this helps you understand more about FileMaker and what you can do with your FileMaker solution. As always, I'd like to wish you much luck. Always feel free to check out FileMakerMagazine.com if you're looking for more in-depth understanding and knowledge about using FileMaker to make real software. And until next time, much luck and happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.FileMakerMagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.